What I'm first going to start with is just kind of going over almost everything you might need for a drywall repair and a painting project. Generally starts first with the drop cloths. There's a lot of different choices depending on what you need, what you're doing, what you need to repair. You have your simple plastic types of drop cloths. You have your runners, and then you have also your big canvas types of drop cloths. I always suggest using them. It's much easier to pick up a drop cloth than it is to clean, especially if you're going to be doing repairs. Drywall dust definitely gets everywhere from cutting into it to sanding it. And of course, when you're going to paint, when you're done, you're going to want something to protect the floor from the painting products. Here's a few different types of plaster and spackling types of compounds. There are a lot of different types of products on the market, from very quick setting Durabonds and plaster Parises to vinyl spackle to lightweight spackle. They all have a different place and do a different job. As far as coating over certain products, some of them will be really quick within a few hours, and some of them will be a few days to paint over. So I always suggest reading the back of the can and follow the recommended directions on there. Another big thing to be aware of, more so for the painting, is your painter's tape. Taping off something you don't want to get tape on it. There's a lot of different selections with tape as well. Speaking with one of the professionals here, let them know what you want and they'll help guide you to the right products, right tape to use. Some of the other things you're going to need for drywall repair is a nice keyhole saw. These are really great if you're cutting out something for an outlet or a switch cover or something like that, or you have to cut out a repair. Another thing that you'll definitely need is different types of sandpaper. This is a generic drywall screen. There's different types of sandpaper. And then we also have the rubber blocks. These are really nice for getting into corners and edges and things like that. A lot more difficult using something like this. The other thing you're definitely going to need is some different types of putty knives and plaster knives, a different assortment. Generally speaking, you're going to want a wider blade and something to put it on with. Depending on the size of the repair you're doing. Another useful tool is a 7-in-1 or an 11-in-1 tool. These things have a lot of different functions to them, but it's nice for scraping and doing things like that. With the plaster tools, here's for an inside corner, and here's one, or for an outside corner, excuse me, and this is for an inside corner. These are really handy tools if you're doing a lot of corners, and especially if you're more of a novice and you don't have the technique and the touch for making everything just right. These are great tools to use. Always a utility knife is something nice. You always want to kind of make sure your edges are nice and clean and kind of free of burrs. When I do a repair, we'll go over that as well. Here's an interesting tool. This can be used to mix dry plaster, but generally it's used to mix paint. This is a larger one, generally used for a 5-gallon bucket. If you have paint that's been sitting around for a few months and you want to use it again, it should be stirred or mixed with something like this. They do make smaller ones for gallon containers. Something else you're definitely going to need is a roller frame if you don't have one, and some good covers. I always suggest reading the paint can to see which cover they recommend. It can change a lot from a 3/8 nap all the way to a 1-inch or even bigger nap, depending on what you're coating, block wall or something like that. So it's always best to read the can, assess what you're doing, and if you have questions, the professionals here are always here to help. Another thing you're definitely going to need is a good quality brush. I always recommend a high quality brush, especially when you're using high quality paints. It's just going to make the job look a lot better, be a lot easier to apply. And a high quality brush generally will last a lot longer as long as you take care of it. It'll take care of you. Another thing is a trim guide, as opposed to using, say, the painter's tape. A lot of people would choose to use this, and maybe you put it over your baseboard as you're coating the wall and you're cutting it in. It's a nice tool to use. Keep in mind it works best on walls that are pretty flat. Sometimes we get into those old plaster walls, you're like this, you'll get a lot of drips and things like that. Might be better off to use tape in a situation like that. But it's a great tool in the right circumstances. Here's a couple of different repair kits for drywall. This one is actually, if you have a larger hole, it tells you how to fix the hole. Cut a square out of it, use another piece of drywall on top of it, and use these clips on the inside to attach the drywall to it, and then plaster over it. Here's a smaller kit for a hole in the wall, and we'll take a look at that in a minute as well. A couple other things are tape for actual large joints and cracks and things like that. Keep in mind there's a big difference between damage to a wall and a stress crack in drywall. You will not be able to repair a stress crack in drywall permanently until the foundation of the building or whatever's causing the stress crack is repaired. A lot of times you can use something and it'll look good for a few months and then you'll get a stress crack back. So it's important to understand the difference between repairing something that's damaged versus a stress crack, because those cracks will continue to come back as long as the property's settling or whatever's causing it keeps happening. There's generally two different types of tapes. There's the mesh tape, which I generally prefer, and it's a little bit better for more novice people. It does have an adhesive on the back, so it will stay in place where you put it. And it's very nice because the drywall compound or the mud will pass right through it. The other kind is the paper tape, generally used a little bit more in the professional industry. I do get a lot of questions sometimes, should I wet my tape, shouldn't I wet my tape? A lot of that goes down to personal preference. On a day where it's going to be really dry out and you've got a lot of wind and the plaster's going to dry out pretty quick, it might not be a bad idea to get this a little bit damp first. And then of course we'll talk about some top coats and some primers as well. So does anyone have any questions before I get into demonstrating some of the smaller repairs that we're going to face?
Repairing a stress crack. What happens if you repair it by putting one of those? If you repair a stress crack by applying one of those mesh or the paper, if the crack recurs, is it going to stretch it? What's it going to?
Well, actually, I have a personal experience with this, so I can speak directly to it. I have a few stress cracks in my home. The best way to do a temporary repair is definitely to use the tape. Just using compound or something like that, it's going to crack back pretty quickly. Using a tape like this, applying a nice coat and spreading it out will definitely help. But what will happen is you'll just see the crack kind of reappear again. A lot of times it won't be strong enough to break the tape. At least I hope not, because you might have some really bad problems if it breaks the tape. But a lot of times a little hairline crack will just come right back within 6 months to a year. So it's a nice temporary fix for a stress crack, but it's certainly not permanent. You have to solve the underlying problem to fix that. So, but it's a nice temporary fix if, for an apartment or, Christmas dinner or something like that. We got to take care of a few things. A stress crack? No. A stress crack would need to be addressed, the underlying cause of it, whether it's from an exterior door moving or your foundation settling or something like that. You would need to address the underlying cause and then do the repair, and then it should last.
We had one here.
How can you tell between a stress crack and a regular thing on a?
Well, usually if there's a damage, you can tell it's damaged. Most stress cracks are very hairline, and they're generally not too straight. A lot of times they will follow a tape joint though, so they will kind of follow an order, but they do get kind of jaggedy, and they're usually really small. They're generally pretty small hairline cracks. A lot of times you paint over it looks pretty good, paint dries and the crack's back right away. Interior paint doesn't do a really good job of filling small gaps and cracks. Most of the exterior paints do a lot better job when you really need that type of protection for the exterior. But stress cracks are generally very thin and fine. And if you do a repair on one and 6 months later it comes back, you know you've got a stress crack there. Okay, well, yes?
It's kind of a prep question. I have a room that has a textured finish
Ceiling?
on the ceiling and then down to the ceiling molding.
Okay.
And I removed the ceiling molding. I want to remove the textured part all the way up to the ceiling. What's the best way to do that?
Something like this. I would suggest scrape. A lot of that stuff is applied with the paint. There's different ways of doing a lot of different things, but usually when you have that, it's usually just a little bit of plaster that is applied when the paint's applied, and usually it'll scrape. You can scrape it right up to the ceiling. It should come off pretty easily. Some of them are a little bit different, but generally speaking, those should scrape off pretty nicely for you. I would scrape it till you get to the ceiling, and then pass some type of sander across it to kind of smooth it out. The worst repair is trying to fix something in a popcorn type of ceiling. Those get a little bit more difficult because you can't mess with it too much and you can't sand it because of the popcorn. So, but thankfully it's on a ceiling. You use flat paint, and usually the popcorn's actually there to help blend in any imperfections so it distracts your eye and you don't see it. On a big smooth wall, you get one little mark or one little crack and you're going to see it right away. So that's usually why they do the ceilings that way. All right, for small repairs, generally speaking, you got a little hammer mark or a little screw head or a little nail head. Generally don't have to do a whole lot to these. You just take your compound, and here I'm just going to use your everyday old mud or your +3. Again, there are a lot of different types of products out on the market. Some of them are very, very quick setting. Some of them come in powder form. So it's just going to depend on your job, what you're doing, and how you're trying to get it done. Most of these will dry in a day like today. It might take a little bit longer with the humidity. But something like this, I would say, would take maybe 2 coats. You'd put it on, make sure you fill the hole up or the void up all the way. Force it in there if you can. And let's see if we can get it in there. Now, a lot of these products will shrink a little bit, so you will have to come back and give it a second coat. But generally speaking, they do a really nice job of filling in small holes like that. What you do after this step is you allow the product to dry the appropriate amount of time. And remember, temperature, air movement, and humidity are all going to affect not only the dry time of the patch, but also the paint. Usually when you see the instructions, it says 24 hours to dry and sand. That's under standard conditions, 70, 75 degrees, moderate air movement, and lower humidity. So on a high humid day, and say in a bathroom, as you close the door, it stays humid in there, it's going to take a lot longer for the patch to dry as well as the paint. Once this is dry, you'd come back with either a sanding pad or a pole sander with an attachment on it. Give this a quick light sand and go over it with one more coat. Let that dry, another sand, and you'll be ready to start your painting. We'll go into painting in a minute, but I'm going to demonstrate a couple more situations to you. I guess I got a little aggressive with this hole here. This is a little bit of a bigger crack or damage to the drywall. And on something like this, it might be a good idea to use tape. It may not be necessary. This is a little bit of a smaller one, but this will give you an idea. Again, we talked about this repair kit for if you have a big hole and you have to cut it out. This will attach another piece of drywall to the drywall, so you'll basically be putting a piece of drywall over your hole here. And in that case, you're definitely going to want to use some type of tape. And here we go. Thanks. So you always want to get the tape. Make sure that you're at the top and the bottom of the space. Here, let's just do that. Like I said, the nice thing about this tape is it does have an adhesive in it, so it will stick for you and you don't have to mess with it. You can put the mud on first and then put the tape over it, or put the mud on. Either way, I generally like putting the tape on. But if you were going to do a major repair where you were going to put another sheet of drywall, you would want to make sure that every seam that you're going to coat has some type of either this tape or the paper tape. Again, generally for the novice or the consumer, I generally recommend the mesh tape. It's just a lot nicer. It sticks, it's self-adhesive, and the mud will pass right through it, and it's a little bit easier to use. For this one, basically, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go through, make sure that we get the compound deep into the crack. Make sure we fill it up all the way, and come back. And you're going to want to try to, on the first coat it's not as important, but on the second and probably the third coat you're going to want to try to feather this out as best as possible. So you're going to want to let this dry, come back and lightly sand it again. Now for this one, on your second coat, you're going to want to use a little bit of a wider knife. You're going to want to get some mud in there, and you're going to want to work it out a little bit to both sides to spread out the seam, the repair. The bigger the repair is, the more spread out it is, the less obvious it's going to be to your eye. Keep in mind, we are going to build it up a little bit because the tape, even though it's very thin, it still has some height to it. So there will be a little bit difference here, and you want to eliminate that difference as much as possible with the plaster. Get it down nice and smooth as possible. And then basically the next one is going to be roughly the same thing. I wanted to make a little bit of a bigger sample for you though. and something like this. Again, we're going to want to take our tape, and if it were, like I said, in fact, I'll do one on the side here for you. There we go. Press that down, and then I'll just pretend we've got a larger space here to repair. And remember, the larger your repair area, the bigger your final tool is going to be. And even in some instances, a tool this big isn't even wide enough. A lot of times you'll even get a bigger one or something like that if you really have to spread out a big gap or a crack or something like that. This is how I would do a stress crack as well. Like I said, you got a tiny little hairline crack. For a temporary repair, I would put a piece of this right over it and then put your mud in here, and I'll go ahead and show you how I would do that. Stress cracks, generally, you're not going to get too much fill in them, but you are going to want to make sure you bury the tape all the way.
How do you handle a stress crack in the corners?
Basically, how do you handle a stress crack in the corner? Basically about the same way. You can take this tape and fold it, but more easily, if you notice on this tape, there's actually a line in the middle where this tape will actually fold in half, and you could put the tape in the inside corner. Outside corner, a lot of times we have corner guards, or there's actually a piece of metal that you can use, or plastic, that you can put on the outside corner, and then you would basically cut it in with tape again, do the same thing with tape and tape around the edge of the corner and plaster it in. For something like this, want to make sure again that we get as much in there as we can. Now, on larger cracks, you might want to talk to the guys in the store, and they might say, hey, for this, you might want to get a quick setting, like a half hour or an hour dry time, something that sets up really quick. Typically, this +3 and stuff that comes wet like this, generally it has to dry by evaporation. Some of the other ones, the powders and things like that you mix, actually dry by chemical cure, so they get harder a lot faster, so you can sand them. They fill holes, bigger holes and things like that a little bit nicer and a little bit quicker. And it's always important, again, to remember to try to spread it out as much as possible, because really what you're trying to do is you're trying to blend this in, trying to blend this in without, you know, showing, without people being able to see where you've repaired your walls.
Brian, question over here, please.
Yes.
Do you have anything in the bucket that dry fast?
There are a few products on the market. I'm not sure everything that they have here in the store.
I'll check real quick.
Okay. There are a few things that do dry a little quicker, but generally speaking, the stuff you get that's wet is going to generally take air to evaporate and the water to evaporate and dry.
And one
Hang on
more.
1 second. Yes.
How do you determine whether you need a quick drying product or some that you need more setup time? How do you
A
determine?
lot of it depends on your skill, how big your repair is going to be, how fast you want to get done with it. Generally, for bigger holes and gaps, or for your first coat when you're putting it on heavy, a lot of professionals would choose to use something quick set so they can fix it, come back relatively quick, sand it, and then put a coat of something like this on there. Keep in mind, your ones that's set by chemical cure, the ones you typically mix and you have 20 minutes or a half hour or an hour to use, are going to get pretty hard and they're not quite as easy to sand. So you don't want to have too many build-up spots on it. Really, with your first coat, you don't want to build up too much anywhere. You want to just make sure you get filled what you want to fill. On something like this is almost dry already here. So what you would do is you would come back to this, sand it down lightly, get it as even as you possibly can, and come back with your second coat on something like this. And really, what you want to do is span the whole patch, and bring it out to both sides as evenly as possible, and come back with a larger knife and remove the excess like that.
And Brian, another question over here.
Yes.
Same technique if it's plaster versus drywall?
Basically
These
the same take. Now, plaster is a little bit more tricky because plaster generally isn't as smooth as drywall, so you'll get a lot of that one you might be able to notice a little bit more, and it'll be a little bit more tricky to sand because again it's generally not quite as smooth as the drywall, but it's the same basic concept.
How long does it take to dry?
It's a lot of it does depend on what you're using, and a lot of it depends on, like I said, humidity, temperature, air movement, and things like that. A lot of the products will be just a few hours air dry time. Some of the faster set ones could be down to 15 minutes, depending on what you're using. Yes. Hang on one second.
The fast set that we have in question is going to all be powder. It's going to be in powder form.
You see, what is the purpose of the tape? It helps the putty forces.
The tape it does a couple different things. One thing the tape does is it helps, especially when we had this deeper one here. This was more of a display if you were joining two pieces of drywall, or if you had to cut out a square and put a piece in there. I kind of showed this so that you could get the idea of how you would work around that. Again, you'd come down and around wherever the square would be. But the tape, it helps hold the mud in place while you're working with it. Otherwise, you get what I call pregnant drywall, where it'll ooze down to the bottom, it'll belly out, and then you won't have as much here on top. This helps hold in place. The other thing it does is it does help keep cracks from coming back. It will help with that a little bit.
Question.
I'm sorry?
The use of these clips for repair?
What about them?
These clips, how you use those clips?
There's pretty easy instructions on the back, but is it okay if I open this? Okay. Basically, your clip's going to look like this. You're going to cut your drywall out. You'd cut it out like this, and there's your spot there. You clip this on the inside, like that. Oops, I think it's like this, actually. So you can actually fit your second piece of drywall into it like this. Apologize, this is a little bit of a newer one. So this is how it would work. And then you would screw your drywall into that, and then take the clips off. I think they just break off the ends here. Once you have your drywall secure to this, and this secure, you can break the clips off. What's that? Oh.
I think you can see.
Yeah, and then it'll snap off for you. So now you've got this done there. You've got. Yeah, what you do is you'd screw the drywall into this here. You'd have one here, one here. If it's a big one, you'd have 2 or 3 of them. It just depends on the size of the hole you're working with. And once it's screwed in place, then you definitely want to take these clips off before you do your repair, because you're probably moving the wall a little bit. If you repair it, you start moving the wall, you're on a chance of cracking it and then having to fix a little bit of a crack that you've created. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. Everyone's kind of got their own way. Another way to do it is to actually just take a piece of drywall, cut it out bigger than you need, and then people will go to the back side of the drywall and cut around the back side, strip the material off of it, and use it as a, let me show you here. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that or not. See, so what I did here was I took a piece out of the back, but I left the face paper in. And if you do that, but make it a little bit wider, and leave the paper on, you can put it right into the hole and use the paper to cover up. You know, you'll have your inside piece will be the size of the hole, but the paper will be extending out about 1 inch or 2. Yeah, exactly. And then you could just put it in there and plaster that in. It stays a little bit loose that way. The clips are a better way to go, but that way will work as well. The other thing you can do if you're in a pinch or something like that, and you do have a big enough hole, I've seen guys put in a little, either a piece of lath or a small board. You slip it in like this, you screw it in place, put another piece in, you screw it into the drywall that's there, and then you take a piece and screw it right into the little piece of lath or whatever that's there.
Brian, we had a question over here.
On the paper tape,
Yes.
what causes a blister and how do you avoid that?
Blisters are usually caused by air pockets that they didn't work out of the tape. When you use the paper tape, it's best is to kind of to make sure you get all the air out of it. There's a lot of times there's air behind it. The other thing that can happen is on a day where it's really dry out, like maybe yesterday, not today, it dries out kind of quick, and sometimes that can distort or warp the tape. If it's a real dry day and you're concerned about that and you're going to use the paper, I'd probably get it a little bit damp first before you use it. Because otherwise what happens is the paper's dry, your plaster's wet, and that paper's just going to suck the moisture right out of that and then cause some issues with drying. All right, so we got our small crack. This first one here is actually probably just about ready, although no, it's not. I got a little bit of a pregnant one going on down here. And this is what I mean when you have a little bit of a bigger repair, maybe than the product can really handle. But basically you'd come back to this, give it a light sand, and put one more coat on it. And this a small repair like that usually should only take 2 coats to do. Any questions about any of that so far? Again, this one's just kind of demonstrate going around a bigger crack or something like that, or a whole repair. The next step for something like this would actually be put on even more mud, depending on the situation, and start at the middle and pull it back so you have even a wider one. So you get a really wide berth, so it's very obscure. Your eye doesn't pick up on it right away because it's a very slow and easy transition, especially in hallways and things like that where you're walking down them. Any imperfections, and it may even make you feel a little dizzy depending on what's going on there. So for the drywall repair, that's pretty much about it. For larger ones, again, you're always going to want to use either some type of kit or something like those clamps or something like that. I wouldn't try to repair anything that's too big with just filling it up with mud. You also run the risk of just falling back into the wall and things like that. So, yes.
Would you have any suggestions on like going back and having to rework a wall around a bunch of existing like conduit runs? So like adding height to if you had an open area above like an electrical room and there's a bunch of existing pipe and conduit running out there, how do you put a drywall around existing conduit runs?
You mean going into a wall? It's like there's a hole there for the
coming out.
Say you have a wall and then there's like electrical and stuff above where the wall stops and you need to extend that wall up higher. Is that what you're saying?
I see what
Like
you're
a
saying.
lot of outlets and stuff. How do you work through tight spaces?
It's tricky. There's really no quick answer for that. A lot of times the nice thing is it's usually up high and it's a little bit above the conduit. It's not going to draw your eye right away. A lot of times you'd only be able to use a putty knife, and this might even be too big for something like that. If you need backing or something in there, it just depends on the situation, what's there or ready to work with. If you've got something behind it where you can stuff something in there to create a backing. I used to use newspaper in the day. I'd recommend using some type of fiberglass or even maybe wadding up some tape and putting it in there. Are you talking about actually adding a piece of drywall to that? Okay. Yeah, that's a little more tricky. Maybe an easier thing to do would be to come from underneath with some type of support to bring in behind the wall and screw it in, so that way you can screw in a small piece to the top. If there's no edge to catch on a joist or a rafter or something like that. But a lot of that's just it'll just be very dependent on the situation, and it's hard, slow work and tedious.
Another one over here.
Do you have time to discuss applying texture after a repair, say on the ceiling, like a popcorn ceiling?
I can slightly address it. That's another one that's a lot of technique. There's a few different products on the market to use. I always tell people, when you're doing anything like that, you're going to want to do a sample somewhere to make sure it's visually like what you want it to look like. Maybe go in a closet or something like that. Maybe if you're doing a small repair at the top or trying to add drywall to the top, you might want to do a little something and then try a few different things in an inconspicuous corner or something like that. And that way, if you don't like it, it's not going to be viewed very easily. So, but there are things out there that will actually kind of spray a little texture on there for you and things like that. The harder thing to do is actually paint the popcorn ceiling. Because if you try to use a roller or a brush on a popcorn ceiling, you're going to knock a lot of it off. It's going to start clogging your roller up. It's going to kind of make a little bit of a mess. Generally speaking, it's a little easier to call a professional in or somebody and have them just shoot a quick spray coat on there, as it's a lot easier to do that than to try to roll on it. Small areas, no big deal. Maybe you could put a little bit of paint on there and kind of stipple it in like that. But if you start brushing back and forth or you start rolling on it, you're going to knock a lot of that off, and you're going to start getting clumps in here and things like that. So, all right, now that our wall has been repaired, or mostly repaired, The next step is painting. I get a lot of questions from people about, well, there's paint and primer in one. Do I need to use a primer? A lot of that's, again, very situational. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't necessarily. My personal opinion, if you're doing repairs and you've got plaster on the walls, I think it's always best to put a good coat of a good primer on there, a primer sealer. Something like our Fresh Start is a great product to use for that. It's an interior, exterior, all-purpose product. You can even put it on hard to stick to surfaces and it adheres very well. It also does a good job of sealing it out. And what I mean by sealing it, or we call it hold out, basically where you've done your repair versus the other part of the drywall, the porosity, the rate that it's going to absorb moisture is going to be a lot different. So when you paint that, the wall itself may stay wet a little bit longer, but over your patch where it's more open and drier, it's going to pull the moisture out of the paint a little quicker. And what can happen is you get what we call flashing, where it's a little bit of a different sheen over your plaster mark. So I always recommend, especially if it's going to be a big repair or if it's going to be in the middle of a hallway or when you walk into a house, it's like right there. Something like, if it's an inconspicuous area in a small corner in a short hallway where it's kind of dark, not a big deal. But if it's on a big wall or hallway or something like that that's easily seen, I would recommend priming it first. Yes.
The new paints have paint and primer.
Correct.
Is that okay to?
Well, again, they generally work fairly well like that, and it's generally more for kind of repainting so that you don't need to use a primer every time you repaint, and for small repairs. But if you're going to do a bigger, larger repair, I would definitely recommend, even if it's a paint and primer, which all the premium, super premium products, our Regal Select and our Ben are paint and primer in one. But again, for bigger repairs in areas that are visually, it'd be easy to see, I would recommend priming it just to avoid that flashing issue.
Over here, Brian.
A word on color matching.
I'm sorry?
A word on color matching colors.
Well, that's actually a nice kind of lead-in. We have these wonderful little paint samples. They come in, they're eggshell finish, which is typically 90% of what we use on walls and things like that. And we can make any of our Benjamin Moore colors in these, and we can do some competitive matching in these as well. So if you had another color from someone else, we could get a formula tinted up, maybe put some on the wall or whatever, see if this is the color you like. If not, it's a nice inexpensive way to make sure, or if you're even just doing a small repair on a wall, it's a great way to do it instead of getting a quart or a gallon of paint to do something like that. But these are a great little tool. Benjamin Moore, we have roughly about 3,500 colors. But again, if there's not one that you don't like, or there's a competitor's one you do like, we can do a little match at the store, tint up something like this. Not all of the competitive matches we'll be able to make in a small pint. We might have to go to a quart in some cases, but it's better to do a little sample than regret what you did later.
So how we will bring the sample to match the color?
You can bring in a sample, or if you can say a friend of mine or someone, I saw it at someone's house and they told me that was paint brand X, color number 762. Come in here, they'll look it up on the computer, and then they'll do a computer match. The computer matches generally are pretty good. Sometimes they're off a little bit. Keep in mind, there's tens of thousands of colors out there, if not more, from a bunch of different manufacturers, so they're not actually tinted in the lines. It's computer estimates where they'd be. So if you do have a sample, it's always best to bring it in to compare it. But we can, the other thing that'll do, if we do like company X's color 1, 2, 3, what the computer will do is it'll say, hey, this is the closest Benjamin Moore match to it. Take a look at this color and see if that's what you're looking for. And then I would suggest, if you like that color, just using that one, and that way I can be sure it'll match up nicely. Now, I said we do have about 3,500 colors. We definitely do not have them all out on the sample display. So they're in the Fandex and they have them back here. So if there's a color that's not out there, they'll have it in the Fandex so you can take a look at it to see if it's the color that you're looking for. Yes?
Paint flaking or chipping on the ceiling right underneath the roof. The roof has been repaired, so I'm not concerned about continued water damage. But what's the prep process for painting the ceiling?
Basically, it's going to be the same thing as kind of like a small crack or something like that, a small repair. Obviously, anything that's loose or peeling or flaking has to come off. It's basically you have a couple rules to painting. You want it clean. Generally, you want it dry. You want it dull and you want it stable or sound, so there's nothing, you know, loose or flaking coming off of it. Using some type of scraping tool, I would scrape everything and anything that's loose. Come back and do a light coat with the spackle over any of those areas that you may have to cure the unevenness of paint layers, or maybe you took off some paper from the drywall may have peeled off or something like that. Kind of want to make it nice and even. Usually it's very, very shallow, so you wouldn't need a tape. If it happened to be a little deeper, you might want to use some tape to do that. Give it a light sand, and for something like that, I absolutely 100% recommend using a primer. Most paints are not going to seal a water stain. I learned that when I was maybe 12. I had a small water stain in my mom's apartment, and I tried to fix it by just painting it, and every day it just kept coming back on me. So I definitely recommend using a primer on something like that.
Primer will fix it.
Yes, absolutely. A good primer will.
I had a client that's moving out of a condo. She has to leave it in clean condition, obviously. She's an artist. She had pictures in each room, 5 different colors, okay? Take the pictures off. There's obviously little hangers or little nail or something. Has to restore the room to original condition, but doesn't have the original paint. So I have to touch up the little nail holes. Obviously, I have to buy a whole quart of paint to touch up my little nail holes.
Well, not necessarily. If you know what color, we have the paint samples.
The smallest container.
Yes.
That'll be able to get from what does that one cost versus the quart?
Everything's going to vary a little bit. I'm not sure the cost of these. Quart, it's going to depend if you want a quart of Ben or a quart of Regal. So that's going to vary a little bit. I want to say these are, well, Jay will find out. I don't want to give you the wrong price.
My point is, like, to buy either a pint or a quart to touch up four little nails, it's like overkill, and she can be stuck with this almost full quart of paint for me to touch up 4 little holes.
Right.
So.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's pretty much no way around
that's
that.
what I told him too, but I didn't know they had a smaller container.
Yeah, these are really nice, and
They
this
can
is
mix those
eggshell
up
in
too,
here.
Smaller, like those for all colors.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah. We have the bases in these and everything, so we can make pretty much any color we want in the pint samples. So again, for smaller jobs, it's really nice. You just get a little pint, use that. It's great.
And a question here.
Earlier, you had referred to the flashing.
Yes.
You know, when you're patching, you see through. Let's say that exists already, and you want to correct it. As an example, I noticed with the higher the sheen, the more.
Absolutely.
You
Yeah, you know what? I'll touch on sheen right now since you led me into it. But if you do have something on the wall already that's flashing, and sometimes it might appear to be flashing where it looks like it's a little bit of a different sheen, it's a little higher in gloss or a little duller. Sometimes it's not even a true flashing. Sometimes it's just the texture. Because generally where you do your repair, it's going to be a lot smoother. You're going to sand it, and it's going to be smoother than the rest of your walls that were painted. So a lot of times that can actually throw your eye off, and it might look like it's a little bit different when it actually isn't. And if that's the case, sometimes just a coat of paint will help that, because it'll kind of help even the texture out across all that. But if you're getting real flashing where you've done a repair, and sometimes if you get flashing too, if you went over it and it wasn't ready to be painted yet, and it was still what we call hot curing, you can get a little flashing over that. If you run into a situation like that, my best bet is to prime the whole area and then recoat it, and that should take care of the problem. But touching on sheen, we all know a lot about sheen already. We all have cars. We've seen cars. There's tons of them in the parking lot. They're all really shiny cars. What happens? You get one tiny little dent or one tiny little scratch in there. You can see it from 5 miles away. And that's why higher sheens are a lot harder to work with, you know, your bathrooms, your kitchens, and things like that. The higher in sheen, though, also means a lot more protection. So it's a lot easier to wash. It's a lot more durable. It can take a lot more abuse as far as scrubbing and cleaning. The lower the sheen, the more imperfections it hides, any differences in the walls, like the flats do. That's why we put flats on the ceiling. Generally, the ceilings like are in here, they're wide open, and you can see from one room all the way out to the back of the house. And you're going to want something very, very flat on the ceiling, so when there are little differences in either height or small little cracks somewhere, you don't pick up on them, you don't see them right away. So flat paint helps hide that. The problem is they don't wash as well. They're a little bit harder to clean and harder to maintain, but they do touch up nicer. So it's always kind of a balancing act. Should I go flatter? Should I go shinier? Well, it depends. You know, are you the kind of person that doesn't mind once in a while coming around doing a little bit of touch up? If you use flat paint, it's going to touch up nicer. If you're in an area where you can't really do a lot of touch ups and things like that, you're going to want more durability so you can clean it better. Then you might want to go a little higher in sheen. So,
Over here, Brian.
yes.
Do they have like graffiti-proof paint?
Graffiti-proof paint. There's basically
paint or stain-proof paint.
There's basically two types of products to use for graffiti resistance. There's one that they call sacrificial. It's a clear coat. It's obviously generally for exterior. And you put it on the wall, and when someone comes and marks it up, there you have a chemical you use and you wash it off, and the coating comes off with it, and then you put another coat on and you're good to go. The other kind is what they call a resistant kind, or the kind of clear coat that you put over your wall or whatever you want to protect that can hold up to really strong chemicals. So you can come back with a strong chemical, wash it off, and then it'll go back to looking the way it was. So there's two different ways to do that for that. Yes.
I don't know. I was like thinking if there's some kind of paint where, like, if someone sprays and then that marking would just go off immediately. Is there anything like that, maybe?
I'm sorry.
There's stuff available. I don't have it in the store, but it is something that we can order.
You mean something like you spray on there to help wipe it off or something?
No, it just comes off by itself.
Okay.
It doesn't. Well, you'd have to. It's more cleanable. It actually is a protective coating over the top coat. Yeah, and it's usually used on exterior for garage doors and brick and stuff like that. That can be available. I don't have it in the store, but we can get that.
All right, so we talked a little bit about sheen, talked about the repairs, talked a little bit about priming, and the last thing to talk about would be your top coats. Paint is a kind of a unique thing. Paint's like most everything else. You generally get what you pay for. So there's some lower, moderate type products out there that generally do a fairly decent job. Almost everything's going to have a little bit of a give and take to it. I generally prefer to think that you're going to paint your interior walls. Typical repaint is 7 to 10 years, sometimes longer. I know the paint in my house is a lot longer than that, probably closer to 20 years in some rooms. So you're going to want it to look good and look good longer. So I always recommend using a higher quality paint. When you're talking about coating, it's a little bit more important sometimes to figure out how much or take into mind your cost per square foot versus just the cost of the gallon of paint. It's like saying, well, I can sell you gasoline, it's going to cost you about 50% more, but you'll get 80% more mileage out of it. Well, I don't want to spend that money on gas, but if I can go a lot further, then maybe it'd be worth it. And it's the same thing with paint. If you need to put 2 or 3 or 4 coats on of an inexpensive product, is that saving money? Your actual cost per square foot could go up a lot just because of that. Plus the labor, whether you're paying somebody to do it or you're doing it yourself, it's going to either take more time or take more money to put on. Speaking of that, this is our premium finish. This is our Ben. It comes in a flat, an eggshell, and a semi-gloss paint. We carry it here in the store. One of the unique things about our premium and super premium products at Benjamin Moore's, we tint them now with a waterborne colorant system. 10 years ago, we used to use glycol-based colorants. And when they first came out, they were actually introduced to oil-based paints. Then we developed latex-based paints, and we developed the colorants that go in oil and latex-based paints. It's convenient for the store, however, it actually weakens the paint. So when you start putting a lot of colorant in traditional paint, you get the dark reds or blues, whatever, what have you, it's actually making the paint a little weaker. It's going to take longer to dry. And a lot of times if you're using a flat or an eggshell and you put a lot of colorant into it, it'll also bump the sheen up. It'll be shinier than you thought. Well, I got a flat, it looks like an eggshell. I got an eggshell, it looks like a satin. And a lot of times that'll happen when you add a lot of colorant. About 10 years ago or so, Benjamin Moore developed a waterborne colorant system. So we don't have to worry about putting it into the same oil and latex-based paint. It's designed specifically for latex-based paint. The other improvement is we actually have a resin, a latex resin, which gives its paint all of its most of its characteristics actually in the colorant. So when we add colorant to these products, it literally makes the products better products than they were before the colorant was added to them. Like I said, the Ben is kind of our entry-level premium. It's a really great product. It's kind of a nice universal product to use. There are 3 sheens in this. However, our Regal Select is on our waterborne system as well. And this comes in actually 5 different sheens, a flat and a matte. And that generally brings up a question, well, what's the difference between flat and matte? Well, matte generally came out because flats, like I said before, are very hard to wash. They're difficult to wash. They're also hard to release stains. So if you have a stain, flat paints don't generally release it very well, in which case you'd have to paint over it or do something to address the stain. So we developed a matte finish, and matte has just got a slight sheen to it over the flat to give it just a little bit more washability and a little bit durability. So if you're painting a ceiling, I would say the flat paint. If you're doing a wall, I would use the matte paint. Then it has an eggshell, a pearl finish, which is nice. It's kind of like a satin. It's in between an eggshell and a semi-gloss. A lot of times you kind of want a little bit more sheen in an area, kitchen to bath around your trim, but you don't want too much sheen. Pearl's a great way to go. It's clean, it's very washable, and it's not too shiny where it's going to be obnoxious. Some people just don't like sheen at all. And then, of course, we also have that in a semi-gloss as well. We can make basically any color you want in any of these products. We have all of our bases, so take care of pretty much all your needs with that.
The Regal is the high end? Is that...
The Regal would be considered a super premium, yes.
How durable is the eggshell in connection with cleaning?
Eggshells generally clean a lot, will clean better than your flats will. For moderate cleaning and things like that, eggshells hold up just fine. Again, in kitchens, you're probably going to want to go up a little bit higher in sheen to say a pearl or a semi-gloss finish or a satin, depending on the manufacturer. But generally speaking, eggshell for your dining room, your hallways, your front rooms, and things like that, it works out very nice, and you can clean on them. Now, there's a difference between washability and scrubbability too. A lot of the flats and the eggshells will wash very nice, but they're not really scrubbable. So if you really need to get on them and scrub and things like that, they're probably not going to hold up quite as well as a higher sheen will. When you start talking about pearl, satins, and semi-glosses, we start talking about scrubbability versus washability. And the higher sheens, like I said before, will release stains easier. So if you got a stain on there, it'll come off easier without scrubbing as hard on it. So,
on the existing painted wall, is it better to put a coat of primer and then a coat of paint, or two coats of paint?
it depends. If you have an eggshell wall that's been painted a few times and you know it's well sealed, someone who initially painted it put a good primer on it to begin with, probably better off with 2 top coats. If you're a little unsure about the wall and we've had some repairs and things like that, it's probably better to use 1 primer. Now that said, a lot of these primers can be tinted a little bit. So if you're going with a medium or a darker color, we can tint the primer a little bit to kind of push you towards the color of the top coat. I always, when it can be avoided, I do not recommend putting the primer as the same color as the top coat, because if you miss a spot, it's hard to see. And the primer is definitely not a top coat. Primers are not washable. Primers are generally very flat, so you will see a difference in the dry film. So I definitely recommend it being at least a little bit different than the top coat color, so you can see if you missed a spot or something like that.
What about inside where there's smoke stain?
Smoke stain, definitely a good primer sealer like our Fresh Start right here. That's why I say I like this a lot. It's a multi-purpose interior, exterior, 100% acrylic primer. It does a great job of sealing stains in. It also does a great job of making sure the whole surface is sealed evenly so you don't get flashing and different differences in the appearance of the paint when you're finished. Yes?
A word on how to know the quality of a paint.
Quick way is price. It's very hard to tell. A lot of people will say, well, it depends on your volume solids. Well, this has got 80% volume solids. It's got a lot of guts in it. It should be great. Well, if the guts are dirt, it's not really a high quality product. Most of the premium, super premium manufacturers you see, it's really about how their prices or how the products are set up in the store here. You have your commercial products and you have your residential types of products. There's really no quick answer for that. I mean, I'm very biased. I think ours is pretty much one of the best ones on the planet. So, I kind of feel that way. The other thing to remember too is, again, you have your paint on your wall for 10, 20 years. A few dollars more up front generally will save you. I've been in places where you got a $10,000 couch and a $20,000 Oriental rug, and they're complaining the price of paint was $10 more a gallon than they thought it was going to be. So a lot of it's very, it depends a lot on the situation. I always look at it this way. If I were doing it myself, I want to do it once, I want to get it done right, and I want to forget about it. So I want to do something premium. If if I'm doing a maintenance on apartments where we got tenants out, every year, every 2 years, we're just putting inexpensive eggshell or flats on the walls, I wouldn't recommend using a premium. You're kind of just wasting your money. But again, if I'm doing it for myself, I know it's going to be there for a while. I'd rather just go ahead and get it done right.
How long can you store the leftover paint?
That's a very good question. Keep in mind, most of the products on the market, probably 95% are water-based products. Water freezes. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you don't allow your paint to freeze. There is a little give and take in it. There's a few things in there to kind of help what we call a freeze-thaw cycle. But if it freezes solid to the core, it's probably going to be ruined. Easy way. You won't be able to put it on. If it froze, you won't be. It'll be congealed. It'll look like real sticky cottage cheese. You won't be able to put it on. You'll know right away it's no good. The other thing to do for long-term storage, it depends. I mean, you could have a can for a year or so and have it go bad, and another can for 10 years and have it be in pretty good shape. The things to remember if you're going to store paint, first thing you do is never ever put anything in the can. Only comes out. So when you paint, you pour it out in the tray. When you're done with what's in the tray, you get rid of what's in the tray. You don't pour it back in the can. You don't dip your brush in the can. You don't put water in the can. If you need to thin it, take it out of the can, thin what you need, put it back. So anytime you put anything back in the can, you're introducing a new contaminant into the can. You put the lid on it, you come back a year later, oh wow, this stinks, what happened? Well, there's a contaminant got in there, and believe it or not, the microorganisms can eat paint, so they can survive in here. I've opened up cans that were abused, let's say, and I've actually seen mold growing inside of paint cans before. So you never want to put anything into the can. The other thing a lot of guys will do after they pour out the paint, you've used it, you haven't put anything, you haven't dipped your brush in here, you haven't put water in here or anything. After they seal the can, a lot of them will put it upside down like that to avoid the lid skins and things like that. So just be sure your lid's on there all the way, that's all. You have a nice mess.
Meant to seal it in a plastic bag?
As long as the lid's on there tight, I don't think you would need to put it in a plastic bag. Now, you may want to, depending on the situation, you may want to put it in an area where if something happens, the can gets rusty on the bottom or something like that where it breaks open, you don't want it to leak. You might want to put it in an area that'll contain that for you. A big thing to keep in mind is that with corrosion with metal, you don't want to have two different types of metals touching each other. They'll corrode very, very fast if you do that. So you don't want to put this on anything metal. If you do, put a cloth or something there so you keep the metal away from metal. If you put this on cast iron or steel or something like that and left it like that, this spot here would rust very, very fast and cause a hole in the can relatively quickly.
Is that electrolysis?
Yeah, it's dissimilar metals, but yeah, it's basically, you're creating a galvanic cell is what you're doing. And you'll be, depending on the metal, sometimes the metal you put it on will rust faster and the can won't rust at all, or the can will rust really fast and what you're putting it on won't rust. It depends on the what they call electronegativity of the metal that you're using. So,
Good.
one more question?
One more? Okay.
Exterior brick.
Yes.
What would you recommend to?
I love brick. If I don't have to, I generally don't like painting brick. But there's a lot of different things to use. And it depends a lot on the brick itself. Glazed brick on exterior, I would never paint because you're just going to have problems with it unless you can get to a point where it's either the weather is worn it down to a point where it's not even shiny anymore, or unless you're willing to get on it with a chemical or do some heavy sanding on that glazed brick. I probably wouldn't do it. On your standard brick and mortar, I definitely recommend using a good primer on it. This primer is excellent for masonry as well. We do have some specific ones for masonry. They may not carry in the store, but they can order and get them in within a day or so. And then you got a choice with top coats. There's a lot of different things to go. If it's very coarse, you may end up using a block filler, which is basically a very heavy-duty, very thick paint, in which case you're going to need a really thick roller, an inch, maybe even an 1.25 inch roller sleeve to roll it on or something like that. But there's a few different ways to go with brick. And a lot of it does depend on the texture of it, the condition of it, and what you're trying to accomplish. Generally speaking, if this brick's in nice shape, I don't prefer generally not to paint it, but sometimes there's no way around it.